Imagine standing in a vast, sun-baked field over 10,000 years ago. The air is hot and still. A small band of weary hunters and gatherers has just returned to their camp after another long day searching for food. They are exhausted from roaming the wild landscape in pursuit of game and edible plants. But on this day, something is different. As the group settles down, one curious soul scatters a handful of wild seeds into the soft earth, perhaps by accident, or perhaps driven by a daring idea. Weeks later, to everyone's astonishment, green shoots sprout where those seeds fell, a sign that humans have discovered a new way to survive. This simple act of planting seeds marks the dawn of a revolution. It may not have happened in one single day or with one single person, but the moment our ancestors learned to farm was a monumental turning point in human history. It's often called the Neolithic Revolution or the First Agricultural Revolution, the time when people gradually laid down their spears and digging sticks as nomadic foragers and began cultivating crops and herding animals. This shift began around 11,000 years ago and is regarded as one of the most rapid and significant transitions our species has ever undergone. Why was it so revolutionary? Because by learning to produce and store food rather than relying solely on nature's wild bounty, Homo sapiens took control of their destiny, mastered the natural world, and set humanity on a new trajectory. The story of how farming began is a global epic. It's a tale filled with tension, discovery, and hope. From the fertile valleys of the Near East to the rice paddies of Asia, from the mountains of the Americas to the savannas of Africa, different peoples around the world turned to farming at different times, unaware that others were doing the same. In this video, we'll journey through time and across continents to explore the day we learned to farm, not a literal single day, but a pivotal era that forever changed how humans live. We'll look at what life was like before agriculture, the ingenious, and perhaps risky, experiments that early people undertook to cultivate plants and animals, and how those first farms grew into villages, then cities, and eventually our modern civilization. Along the way, we'll highlight the human drama of this transition, the struggles and setbacks, the triumphs and innovations, and the profound emotional impact on those who lived through this change. By the end, we'll see why the birth of agriculture truly deserves to be called a turning point that changed humanity forever. So, let's step back in time and watch the seeds of change take root. Before the farming revolution, every human on Earth lived as a hunter-gatherer. For countless millennia, small bands of people roamed the land, hunting wild animals and foraging for edible plants, fruits, and nuts. It was a life of movement and adaptability. Our ancestors might camp by a river one season and follow migrating herds the next. They carried few possessions and built only temporary shelters, leaving behind little more than ashes from campfires and simple stone tools. Food was never guaranteed. Each day's survival depended on nature's whims. As one famous description goes, it was a lifestyle often seen as nasty, brutish, and short, with no stored food and no relief from a daily search to avoid starvation. While that phrase might be an exaggeration, many hunter-gatherers had rich diets and even ample leisure time. There's no doubt that living off wild resources meant constant uncertainty. Picture a family of early humans waking up with the sun. Their stomachs rumble with hunger. The last berries gathered yesterday have been eaten, and the dried meat from a recent hunt is almost gone. The children cling to their mother, asking when they will eat. The adults know they must move camp or track game for miles if they want to find their next meal. This was the rhythm of life, an unending quest for food that tied people intimately to the cycles of nature. Human populations remained very small as a result. In fact, around 10,000 BCE, before the advent of farming, the entire world's population is estimated to have been only about 5 million people, roughly equivalent to just a single mid-sized city today. With such small numbers, humans could only live in scattered groups, and the idea of large towns or cities was unimaginable. Yet, despite the hardships, these hunter-gatherer communities were remarkably successful. They had a deep knowledge of their environment and moved intelligently with the seasons. Over generations, they learned which plants could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, and how to hunt even the largest of beasts. They even began to manage the landscape in subtle ways. For example, by setting small fires to encourage growth of certain plants, a practice known as fire stick farming in some early cultures. Crucially, our ancestors were observant and inventive. They noticed patterns. Seeds could sprout into new plants, animals followed predictable breeding cycles, and certain areas of land were more fruitful than others. These observations set the stage for what was to come, hinting that perhaps humans could do more than just collect what nature provided. Maybe they could help nature along and secure more food with less wandering. By around 13,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the world's climate began to change. Glaciers receded, temperatures rose, and rainfall patterns shifted. In some lucky regions, wild edible plants became more abundant. In the Middle East's Fertile Crescent, for example, a boomerang-shaped zone spanning modern-day Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, wild wheat and barley started thriving in the warmer, wetter climate. Herds of game animals were plentiful in the open grasslands. People like the Natufians, a prehistoric culture in that area, found that they could settle down in one place for longer periods because food was easier to gather. They built some of the first semi-permanent houses out of stone and mud. We can imagine their curiosity as they harvested wild grain and noticed fallen seeds sprouting near their encampments. These were the first faint signs of a lifestyle shift, a hint that planting and harvesting could one day replace foraging and hunting. But no one knew at the time that this was the dawn of a revolution. For generations, people likely combined old ways and new ways. They still hunted and gathered, but they also experimented with tending plants or corralling young wild animals. Change was slow. In fact, archaeologists believe it took hundreds, even thousands of years for the full transition from pure hunting-gathering to an agricultural way of life. The world before farming was on the cusp of transformation, but not quite there yet. Humanity was waiting for a spark. And when that spark finally caught flame, nothing would ever be the same. So how did that spark ignite? How did humans actually learn to farm? The truth is both fascinating and complex. Farming was not so much invented in a single moment as it was stumbled upon through trial and error, likely by many different people in different places. Our ancestors were experimenters. They were observant foragers, often women who were the primary plant gatherers, who noticed that new plants often sprouted from the seeds of the fruits and grains they collected. Perhaps someone dropped seeds near a campsite and later returned to find plants growing there. Or perhaps they deliberately cleared a patch of land and sowed some seeds to see what would happen. We don't have written records from 10,000 years ago, but we have archaeological evidence that gives us clues about these first steps toward agriculture. In the Fertile Crescent, by around 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, people were routinely harvesting wild cereals like emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley, which grew abundantly in the region. They had tools like sickles and grinding stones, found at sites like Tel Abu Huraira in Syria, indicating that they were cutting grain and processing it into flour or meal. At Tel Abu Huraira, a village inhabited as far back as 11,500 BCE, archaeologists found large stone tools used for grinding wild grains, clear evidence that these people were on the verge of farming. By around 9,500 BCE, a set of plants known as the founder crops of the Middle East had been domesticated or were in cultivation: wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, vetch, and flax. These aren't just random wild plants. They are species that underwent genetic changes under human care. For example, wild wheat naturally shatters and drops its seeds to the ground when it's ripe, making it hard to gather. Early farmers, however, would save and replant the mutant strains whose seed heads stayed intact on the stalk, making harvest much easier. Over time, this human selection turned wild wheat into domestic wheat that conveniently holds onto its grains until threshed. Such small genetic tweaks were the beginnings of plant domestication. Meanwhile, people were also starting to manage animals. Perhaps a hunting band realized that keeping a few young goats or sheep alive near camp was easier than chasing new ones each week. The first livestock were likely animals that humans already hunted for meat. In Mesopotamia, part of the Fertile Crescent, evidence shows pigs were domesticated around 11,000 years ago, followed closely by sheep and goats. Wild boars became domestic pigs, and wild goats, Persian ibex, turned into tame goats. Taming animals was another form of experimentation. It started with feeding or penning wild animals, and over generations breeding the calmer ones. Eventually, these animals became dependent on humans. They provided reliable sources of meat, hides, and dung for fuel, and later on, products like milk and wool. It's amazing to think how people at that time must have felt the first time they kept a young goat through the winter and had fresh milk to drink, or the first time a tamed wild dog helped guard their camp or herd. Bit by bit, humans were forming a partnership with nature, domesticating the very plants and animals they used to simply capture in the wild. One popular theory is that climate change at the end of the Ice Age nudged humans toward these innovations. As the world got warmer and certain wild foods became more abundant, some groups could settle in one area longer and experiment with planting. In the Near East, new seasonal conditions favored wild cereals. In East Asia, growing populations may have pressured people to find new food sources and homegrown solutions when wild resources were stretched thin. Another theory suggests that as humans developed better tools and perhaps new social or spiritual ideas, they were mentally prepared to attempt farming. We find early religious artifacts and art in the earliest farming villages, hinting that a changing worldview might have accompanied the economic shift. Whatever the causes, the transition to agriculture took place independently in various parts of the world, roughly within a few thousand years of each other. It's as if the human species, spread across the globe, all converged on the same big idea without directly contacting one another. That big idea was this: instead of solely trusting nature to provide, we can cooperate with nature to produce. Let's explore these early centers of farming and what was being grown or raised in each. Fertile Crescent, Middle East. Approximately 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. Often considered the earliest cradle of farming, this region's inhabitants domesticated wheat, barley, peas, lentils, chickpeas, flax, and other plants. They also domesticated some of the first farm animals: goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle. By around 8,500 BCE, we see evidence of villages with permanent houses and granaries in places like Jericho and Jarmo. Farming in the Fertile Crescent turned nomads into settlers and led to a population boom in West Asia. From this center, agriculture would later spread into Europe and North Africa, Yangtze and Yellow River basins, East Asia. Approximately 8,000 to 7,000 BCE. In ancient China, people began cultivating rice and millet during the same Neolithic period as farming in the Middle East. Remnants of Stone Age rice paddies in swamps have been dated to at least 7,700 years ago in eastern China, meaning they were already deliberately flooding fields to grow rice. The Chinese Neolithic farmers also domesticated soybeans and mung beans, and in time, pigs and chickens were domesticated here as well. Pigs may have been domesticated independently in China around 8,000 years ago, separate from the Near Eastern pigs. The ability to farm rice, a very calorie-rich staple, allowed villages to flourish along the great rivers of China. This independent agricultural origin would give rise to early Chinese civilization. New Guinea Highlands, Melanesia. Approx. 7,000 to 5,000 BCE. In the highlands of New Guinea in the South Pacific, archaeological evidence suggests people were cultivating crops like taro, bananas, and sugarcane by around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. The wet tropical environment favored root crops and fruit trees. While New Guinea's agriculture remained isolated, it didn't spread widely to other regions due to geographic barriers. It is remarkable as an independent center. The farmers of New Guinea developed their techniques possibly around the same time as those in China, showing again how multiple human societies converged on farming. Sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel and West Africa, approximately 5,000 to 3,000 BCE. Africa's story is complex because farming in some areas was a mix of local domestication and imported crops. In the Sahel region, just south of the Sahara Desert, people domesticated hardy indigenous grains like sorghum and pearl millet by around 3,000 to 2,000 BCE. In West Africa, a local variety of rice, African rice, was independently domesticated by about 1,000 BCE, and tubers like yams and oil palm were also domesticated in prehistoric times. Farther north, in the Nile Valley, agriculture appeared earlier, around 6,000 to 5,000 BCE, but largely due to the influence of crops and animals spreading from the Fertile Crescent into Egypt. So, Africa had multiple agricultural beginnings, some homegrown, some adopted. These allowed African societies in different regions to transition from foraging to farming in their own unique ways. Mesoamerica, Central America, approximately 7,000 to 3,000 BCE. In what is now Mexico and Central America, early people domesticated squash and gourds as early as 10,000 years ago. One of the earliest was the bottle gourd, and a type of squash, likely grown initially for its edible seeds or use as containers. The superstar crop of Mesoamerica, however, was maize, corn, domesticated from a wild grass called teosinte. This took longer. Maize-like plants were being selectively bred by around 7,000 to 6,000 BCE, but the fully cob-bearing corn we recognize appeared by about 5,500 BCE. Natural genetic mutations in teosinte had to be encouraged over generations to create the bigger ears of corn. Once maize was established, it became the staple grain of Mesoamerican civilization. Additionally, beans and chilies were domesticated, and by about 4,000 to 3,000 BCE, maize, beans, and squash formed the famous Three Sisters trio of crops that complemented each other nutritionally and in the field. These farming advances supported cultures like the Olmec, Maya, and later Aztecs, although those high civilizations came much later. Andean South America, approximately 8,000 to 5,000 BCE. In the Andes Mountains and Amazon Basin, early farming took a different form. People domesticated potatoes between 8,000 to 5,000 BCE, as well as manioc, cassava, in the lowlands by around 7,000 BCE. They also domesticated high-protein grains like quinoa and legumes like certain beans and peanuts. Uniquely, the Andes region saw the domestication of animals for food and labor. Llamas and alpacas, relatives of the camel, were domesticated by roughly 4,000 BCE for carrying loads and providing wool and meat. Guinea pigs were kept as a food source as well. Farming in the Andes was often done on terraced hillsides and had to adapt to mountainous terrain. This independent agricultural center laid the groundwork for later Andean civilizations like the Inca. Eastern North America, approximately 3,000 to 1,000 BCE. A lesser-known chapter of the farming story unfolded in what is now the eastern United States. Here, indigenous peoples domesticated a suite of native plants, often called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. These included sunflowers, goosefoot, a leafy seed-bearing plant, sumpweed, and squash, a different species from the Mexican one, by around 3,000 to 2,500 BCE. These were small-scale crops, and for a long time, North American groups combined farming with foraging. Much later, around 2000 to 1000 BCE, maize agriculture arrived north from Mesoamerica and eventually became dominant. But those early local domesticates show that even in North America, people had begun experimenting with farming independently. What's truly inspiring is that none of these early farmers knew about each other. The villagers planting rice in China had no way to learn from the wheat farmers in Mesopotamia. The potato growers in the Andes didn't communicate with the corn growers in Mexico. Yet across the world, humans were reaching the same turning point. They were all asking the age-old question, how can we ensure we have enough food tomorrow? And they all found a similar answer, let's grow our own. This was a dramatic shift in mindset, from accepting what the wild landscape provided to shaping the landscape to provide what humans needed. As agriculture took root, the immediate effects on human life were enormous. For the first time, people began to settle in permanent villages. Instead of moving every season, families could build homes and stay put near their fields. One of the best preserved early farming settlements is Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, dated to around 7500 BCE. Archaeologists have unearthed a town of mud brick houses crammed together like a honeycomb, with no streets. People walked on the rooftops and climbed down ladders into their homes. In its heyday, Çatalhöyük may have housed up to 5,000 to 8,000 people, making it one of the world's first proto-cities. Imagine the sights and sounds: children playing on rooftops, smoke from hearth fires curling into the sky, farmers heading out at dawn to tend their plots outside town, artisans crafting tools or pottery, and families honoring their ancestors by burying their loved ones under the house floors. The people of Çatalhöyük even decorated their walls with vivid murals of hunting scenes and perhaps early spiritual symbols, evidence of a rich cultural life blossoming in this agricultural community. Early farming villages like this fundamentally changed social life. In small nomadic bands, people had only a few personal possessions. They had to carry everything. But in a settled village, we start seeing permanent houses filled with goods, grinding stones, cooking pots, stored food, clothing, and decorations. This indicates the rise of the concept of property. A family's home, its stored grain, its herd of goats, were now theirs in a way that wasn't true for hunter-gatherers. This created new dynamics, sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict. Neighbors in early villages likely had to develop rules and customs for living so closely together and sharing resources like water and grazing land. Leadership structures may have emerged, perhaps elders or councils to manage communal projects, like maintaining an irrigation ditch, or to settle disputes. Over time, these would evolve into chiefs, and much later, kings and governments, but their seeds were planted in the early villages. One of the most important changes farming brought was food surplus. When a harvest was good, a family could produce more grain or tubers than they immediately needed. Unlike meat or fresh fruit, grain could be dried and stored for months or years. Archaeologists find ancient storage pits and clay granaries where early farmers stashed away surplus food. Having a surplus was revolutionary. It meant security against hunger. If next year's rains failed, the village might still have last year's grain saved up. No wonder population grew. Fewer children starved, and more could be fed to adulthood. The numbers tell the story. With farming, the global population exploded from that tiny 5 million in 10,000 BCE to perhaps 50 million by 1000 BCE, and eventually to 8 billion today. Farming could support far more people per square mile than foraging ever could. A single field of wheat yields many times the calories that a patch of forest or prairie the same size would yield in wild foods. Surplus food also had another effect. It freed some people from food production. In a village where most people are farming, perhaps a few individuals could specialize in other tasks, making tools, weaving baskets, or crafting religious items. and trade their services or products for food. This is the birth of specialized roles or professions. Indeed, the Cambridge researchers noted that after agriculture, we see the advent of specialist craftsmen and more complex division of labor. Over generations, this led to an accumulation of knowledge and technology. One person could become an expert potter, producing sturdy pots to store grain. The invention of pottery around this time was probably driven by the need to safely store surplus food. Another might become a skilled flint knapper, making better sickle blades for harvest. Others might focus on spirituality or leadership, perhaps the first shamans or chiefs who didn't farm but were supported by the community's surplus. This was the origin of social classes and occupations, the first spark of what would eventually become a full economic and social hierarchy. However, all these changes were not without challenges and new problems. Surpluses needed to be protected, both from pests and from other hungry people. If one village had a great harvest and the next did not, conflicts could arise. There is evidence that warfare became more common once people settled in villages. Walls were built around some early towns like Jericho, suggesting fear of raids. Living in close quarters and with domesticated animals also introduced new diseases. Cattle, pigs, and chickens carried microbes that could jump to humans. Many of history's plagues, smallpox, measles, flu, were originally diseases of domesticated animals that evolved to infect us. Early farmers, not yet immune to these illnesses, would have suffered epidemics at times. The skeletons of Neolithic people often show signs of malnutrition or infectious disease, indicating health challenges in early agricultural societies. Paradoxically, while farming could produce more food, it also tied people's fortunes to fewer types of food. A hunter-gatherer ate dozens of wild plants. An early farmer might rely on just wheat or rice. If that one crop failed, famine could result. Archaeologists have found that in some early farming communities, average nutrition declined compared to the previous hunter-gatherers. Skeletons from early farmers can be shorter or show more signs of iron deficiency, likely due to a less varied diet. All this led some researchers, like biogeographer Jared Diamond, to famously label agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. He pointed out that with farming came deep social inequalities. Some people amassed wealth and land, others became peasants. The spread of disease, and even the rise of oppressive structures like forced labor or slavery in later farming empires. It's a provocative statement. How could something that enabled civilization also be a mistake? Diamond's point is about the costs paid by individuals during the transition. A foraging life, while risky, might have been more leisure-filled and nutritious than toiling in the fields all day for a meager ration of porridge. We should acknowledge this truth. The agricultural revolution had its dark side, and not everyone benefited equally from it, at least not immediately. And yet, despite the initial hardships, farming undeniably set humanity on a path to immense collective progress. Without it, there would be no cities, no writing, no science or machines, none of the things we associate with civilization. Farming was the platform upon which we built everything that came after. It allowed for the accumulation of surplus food, which in turn led to the accumulation of knowledge and culture. Many facets of modern civilization can be traced to that moment in history when people started living together in communities and cultivating the land. Villages eventually grew into towns and then cities as populations kept increasing. By around 4000 to 3000 BCE, the Bronze Age dawned in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, bringing even more innovations: plows pulled by oxen, massive irrigation networks, and long-distance trade of agricultural goods. The surplus from farming supported artisans who invented metalworking and scribes who invented writing. In Mesopotamia, the earliest writing tablets we've found are actually grain receipts and inventories. They were keeping track of stored barley. Thus, the act of sowing those first seeds led, in a chain reaction over millennia, to the rise of kingdoms and empires. Think of the ancient monuments like the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Sumer. They were built by societies made possible by agriculture. Thousands of laborers could be fed year-round on stored grain while they quarried stone and molded bricks. None of that would be conceivable in a hunter-gatherer world. In Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever farming took hold, it pushed the frontier of human organization. Even areas that didn't adopt farming were changed by it. For example, once neighboring tribes became farmers and grew in number, they often expanded into hunter-gatherer lands, or traded produce for furs and other goods. Over time, nearly every society on Earth either adopted agriculture or interacted with societies that did, until only a few isolated communities of hunter-gatherers remained. It's hard to overstate the legacy of that turning point when we learned to farm. Practically every aspect of our lives today can trace its roots back to the agricultural revolution. Our settled homes, our densely populated cities, our governments and laws, our technologies, even our illnesses, are linked in some way to the choice our distant ancestors made to cultivate land and domesticate animals. Let's reflect on some key ways farming changed humanity forever. Population and settlement. Before farming, humanity was spread thin. After farming, humans began to cluster in larger and larger groups. Permanent settlements led to the concept of homelands and nations instead of nomadic ranges. Today, billions of us live in huge cities, a lifestyle impossible without agriculture's productivity. The fact that we can have specialists like teachers, doctors, or software engineers is because farmers somewhere are producing surplus food for all of us. This all started with those first farmers and their plots of land. Technology and innovation. The needs of farming drove many inventions. Irrigation canals to water the fields, the plow to turn the soil, pottery to store grain, and later windmills and watermills to grind flour. These are just a few examples of technologies spurred by agriculture. The Bronze Age and Iron Age innovations in tool-making were, in part, to make better farm tools and weapons for defending fertile land. Even today, the majority of technology up to the Industrial Revolution was focused on improving agriculture. Tractors, harvesters, fertilizers, etc., enabling the huge population boom of modern times. Social complexity and culture. With farming came villages, then cities, then civilization. Social classes emerged: farmers, priests, rulers, warriors, merchants, bringing complex social hierarchies. Organized religion took new forms. Many early religions centered on agricultural cycles, praying for rain, celebrating harvest festivals. The concept of land ownership was born. Something that was meaningless to a nomad became a central tenet of agricultural societies. Written laws often arose to handle disputes over land or produce. Art and architecture flourished as people settled. From Neolithic megaliths like Stonehenge, built by early farming communities in England, to intricate pottery and weaving that required settled life to create. Human biology. Astonishingly, farming even changed our genes. For example, adult humans originally could not digest lactose, the sugar in milk, after infancy. But when cattle were domesticated in the Neolithic and people began drinking milk, a genetic mutation for lactose tolerance spread rapidly in populations that herded cattle. Today, many people of European, African, or certain Asian ancestries can drink milk as adults, a direct result of the farming lifestyle of their ancestors. Our disease resistances also changed. Those who survived new plagues passed on stronger immunity. In a grim way, farming's diseases made later populations more robust against epidemics, a factor that, for instance, dramatically affected encounters like the Europeans, bringing Old World diseases to the Americas, where indigenous people, never before exposed to those livestock-borne illnesses, suffered horrendous losses. The environment. Farming gave humans unprecedented power over the environment. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation. This was the start of humanity's large-scale impact on nature. While early farmers had tremendous respect for nature's forces, they also unwittingly set us on a path to modern environmental challenges by expanding farmland and raising livestock. The very first farmers could scarcely imagine that one day vast swathes of the planet would be covered in cultivated crops and pasture for domesticated animals. But that is the world we live in now. At the emotional and philosophical level, the agricultural revolution also altered how humans viewed themselves. We were no longer just another species at the mercy of nature. We became shapers of our own destiny, co-creators in the process of life. Myths and stories from agrarian cultures often reflect this new role. Tales of hero farmers who taught people to plant, or earth goddesses who blessed the soil. A sense of connection to the land developed. People saw the same plots of earth year after year and buried their ancestors in that soil, fostering deep attachments to place. The stage was set for everything from patriotism for one's homeland to the notion of fighting wars over fertile territory. All these complex human behaviors germinated from the simple seeds planted by early farmers. As we conclude our journey through this grand turning point, take a moment to marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of those early humans. They likely had no idea that their experiments would echo across thousands of years. The first person who saved seeds from a wild plant and sowed them intentionally was arguably changing the course of history, even though to them it was just a small act of hope for a better harvest next season. Those first farmers persevered through crop failures, learned from mistakes, and gradually perfected the art of cultivation. Because of them, subsequent generations could live a bit more securely. They could dare to build villages, invest time in new crafts, and imagine a future beyond mere survival. It was the foundation of progress. The day we learned to farm was not a single day, of course. It was an age of transformation. But calling it a day is a useful metaphor, because in the grand timeline of our species, the farming revolution is like the sunrise that ended a long night. It illuminated the path forward. With agriculture, humanity stepped into a new day where anything seemed possible. Cities, culture, exploration, invention. We are the heirs of that revolution. Every meal we eat, every building we inhabit, every technological marvel we enjoy can be traced back to that moment when our ancestors decided to plant seeds and tame animals. It's humbling and inspiring to realize how a few simple ideas, planting a seed, penning an animal, unlocked the potential of humanity. From those first gardens grew the roots of modern society. Yes, the journey had pitfalls and prices to pay, but here we stand in the modern world, able to contemplate it all, because those early farmers took the leap. They trusted in a tiny seed and the promise that tomorrow could yield more than today. As we harvest the benefits of that ancient turning point, let's remember its lessons. It reminds us that great change can come from small beginnings, that human innovation, cooperation, and perseverance can overcome even the hardest challenges, whether it was learning to grow food in a fickle climate, or, in our times, finding sustainable ways to feed a growing planet. The story of learning to farm is ultimately a motivational tale of human triumph. Our ancestors literally built the world we know with their bare hands, one seed at a time, driven by the hope of a better life. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's greatest turning points, the day we learned to farm. If you found this story enlightening and thought-provoking, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into turning points in human history. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the most fascinating part of humanity's shift to farming? Leave a comment below and join the conversation. Your engagement helps us grow this community of history enthusiasts. Until next time, remember that the ordinary actions of people long ago, planting a seed, sharing a harvest, have shaped the extraordinary world we live in today. Who knows what seeds of change we might be planting now for the future? Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.